Welcome to the Sky Notes podcast. We're talking about eclipses, both the ones coming up in March and April of 2024 and later in the year. And we give some background into how folks have interpreted the eclipses over the years. This is part one. Welcome or welcome back. We're really glad you're here.
How did you fare through this last few weeks of astrology in terms of, so I'll tell you what I'm hearing, like just from people and clients and my own experience, that it was all very overwhelming. People have been super overwhelmed,
Yeah.
stressed, not sleeping. I'm hearing a lot of. Um, and so there was a lot. It was a really active month. When I look at my list that I made up for an event of the transits, it's like it looks endless when I see it written down here. It's just a lot of astrology, and everybody had to talk to Pluto as they went into Aquarius, and everything that went into Pisces is talking to Saturn.
It's exciting to see that. As I was going over our previous podcast, it was so much fun to conjure up the vision of each of those planets greeting the sun and then Mercury and Venus. I thought that was a super effective way to think about the year, really, but like a slice at a time. So yeah, everything sped up, everything, and also slowed down in weird ways. Like sort of you run into more obstacles, and so you kind of have to figure out how you're going to navigate that, you know. And let's see, with the recent Pluto conjunct Venus and Mars, there it felt like there were a lot of sort of traffic jams emotionally with people that maybe didn't have any content, but there was like enough energy there that sometimes it just shows up as like bam,
Right.
conflicting. So yeah, I have heavy duty brakes on going fast, so I wasn't able to go fast. But I so far have been really enjoying kind of the clarity of the shift initially into Aquarius and now into Pisces. So
It was interesting talking to the group for the
yeah,
transit talk. And the thing that I had remembered hearing Wade Caves say, for people who have a lot of mutable energy in their chart, that these times, if you lack fixed energy in your chart, those times when we have a lot of it is great to be able to anchor things for people who don't have that energy natally. And so that's the thing that I found really interesting. And this kind of might be the breaks thing that you're talking about, where like it almost felt like if you had an idea or something you wanted to go with, you were able to drop an anchor
right.
and turn it into something,
Yeah.
which was really interesting. Just like it was weird because if you are not used to being able to do that, it was jarring
Yeah.
and confusing because all of
Yeah.
a sudden you're like, oh, I had an idea and I was able to do something with it quite quickly. And
Right.
so
Right.
I had that idea for the ebook and it like literally happened in a day. I
So
was able to just to do it, right? And
that's so
that
much fun.
that just doesn't normally happen, you
Right.
know?
Right.
And so that's the thing that I noticed was different with having all the stuff in fixed signs.
I like that you point that out because I will say some of the clients that I spoke with were really, like I said, sort of riled up, right? And then if they got space to kind of feel that riled upness or not, just space to like be like, sure, you're pissed. The next thing that would happen is they'd resolve it and they'd be surprised, but it was sort of like, how do you gate that energy or not even gate it because it is like a spaciousness, how do you offer yourself enough space? For me, it's always very visual. So it's sort of like if someone's, theoretically right in my face, I just shoot them down this long country road that I keep in my mind. And all of a sudden I relax and I can breathe. And so that's kind of what I'm talking about is like moving that tension. But in particular, I noticed that there was a resolution that isn't normally the case.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. That's a really great observation for sure.
Yeah.
It's different. And it's funny because anytime we have an overabundance of air, everybody's really stuck in their heads, right? I
Yeah.
think that's part of the sleeping issue that'll happen,
Yes.
is that the people get really heady. And
Yeah.
so people who are naturally like that are super overstimulated.
Yeah.
People who aren't used to that much air don't know what to do with it. So,
Yeah.
it tends to be disconcerting. Anytime we have an overabundance of anything, there's going to be a reaction, right? And we have this huge, we haven't had fire for a while. And so there's, this weird elemental imbalance that we're going through. And so you could really feel that on top of not having any planets retrograde. So things always feel at warp speed
Yeah.
when nothing is retrograde. And we go through that right through until we don't have anything go retrograde till Mercury goes April 1st.
Yeah.
So we
Yeah.
had 2 solid months of everything direct.
Well, and speaking to the elemental component, I know we've talked about water and air and earth and fire. The fact that Saturn is in Pisces, Melanie Reinhardt was describing that as being waterlogged, and wanting a sense of isolation because you're kind of sunk into your sort of emotional self. And so it's not a public process. And then to kind of dry off, you kind of have to like separate yourself a little bit from the pack. That's what I recall from what she described, but it really resonated because that sense of waterlogged, right? Like you've been in the bath too long. You're not just wrinkly, but like wrinkly and swollen. Like I'm speaking for myself, but you don't want to get out necessarily, but it's time. Again, I'm speaking for myself. That kind of thing where you come back to yourself, you dry off, you get in the fresh air, all of a sudden things are changing and you've kind of created this new template to work off of. So anyway, all of that just to say there is a lot of fire and air, but to me the water is like still watering.
Well, and I also feel like, you know, the water of it is odd. Like it's not, no, nothing in water's happy to be there right now. I mean,
Right.
other than Neptune, who's stoned over in the farthest corner
Right. Right.
doing his own thing. So,
Right.
and so the water is not where it's supposed to be. So it almost to me feels like you have leaks, Saturn and Pisces to me is like you have leaks in your roof and you
Yeah.
don't know how to get rid of them. And
Got
so
it.
your square structure is seeping,
Yeah.
and there's puddles on the floor. And so
Yeah.
it's water where it's not supposed to be.
Yeah.
And so I feel like even my own sense of time has been just off since
Yes.
Saturn went into Pisces. So Pisces being that nebulous energy, formless, nebulous, and then Saturn of structure and rules time. And so
Yeah.
there's this and everybody I talk to has this just our relationship to time since last year is just like trying to figure out when something happened
Right.
is off
Endless.
so skewed right now,
It's
which is
so
so interesting.
yeah.
It's almost like
Yeah.
we're supposed to, change our relationship to those Saturn things or something.
Well, in my mind, speaking of changing the relationship to Saturn, and I apologize, I think we're entering allergy season over here, but uh, I have this like vibe around the watery Saturn placements and also probably the Earth placements where because they're feminine rather than masculine, we're baffled by them when we don't need to be. And so the water, the lack of time, I think about that more from the balsamic angle, the moon phase. Balsamic is almost like a barren phase right before the new moon. And so in that phase, it's approaching birth. And so there's kind of, with the mother, there's this profound change that's about to happen. And of course, with the child, there's this profound change that's about to happen, right? And like those waters are full of stories and full of things. And so when someone has Saturn in Pisces, or when they're grappling with it, I do default to that idea of, Saturn wants to create reality and Neptune wants to create reality, and they're both miserable, and they're especially miserable together. And if you don't cheer them up, like responsibly, miserable things will happen. You can describe them to a T and they will meet your expectations. And who wants that? Not me. So it's that sense of that, like the mystery and magic of birth, and how women are really extraordinary, because of that, and the mystery and magic of creating reality, with the potential for it to go horribly wrong and the potential for it to be just incredible. So I think about it that way. I think about Saturn in Cancer. Get those people to cook. Get them in a kitchen, give them something to do that's homey. Don't take advantage of them, but give them, home, give them their place to kind of create that. And then I haven't really thought about Saturn in Scorpio, but that's probably because it's none of my business. Just there, because Scorpio doesn't want anyone in their business.
But I want to go back to, you said the idea of feminine and masculine, and
Yeah.
people befuddled by earth and water.
Yeah.
I feel like I had 1,000 thoughts when you said that, just thinking about how like so much of our world, whether it's language or anything like that, is created in such an air and masculine sort of way. And
Right.
so I often say that, like, anybody who's got Mercury in a water sign, language is frustrating, especially the English language specifically, because emotionally it's barren.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
to turn things into words with a Mercury and water is frustrating. It's not enough, right?
Right.
The English language does not give it enough to work with,
Right. Yeah.
and so it's interesting. It can be somebody with a Mercury in water can over explain or under explain frustration from not wanting to bother, right am
Right,
I
like
am I
miss the
speaking
point
the truth?
entirely. I think so. And I'll claim that. I have a watery Mercury, and I find quite often that, like, in my head I've got the whole picture of what I'm saying, but I'm counting on the other person to like finish that sentence for me. And it definitely has changed over the years to kind of recognize, like, it's not an arbitrary reliance on words that we have as humans. It's significant. And so I've found my favorites, like I love Arabic languages, because everything has like this long tail of meaning, like wool is spelled the same way as soul, and that's because the soul is humble. And so there are all of these intentional, beautiful meanings that you can derive from these things. And so, and I've often heard Rob Hand saying that Latin is really quite specific. And in some instances, I've seen that where you're translating from Latin and it kind of clarifies, what something means in a different way. And then over explaining,
I mean, but I've experienced both sides of that with you,
yeah.
right? Whereas I've known Mercury and water sign people who consistently under explain,
Mhm.
just they're just quiet, and they just, would rather just experience the feelings than try to put them into words. I've met Mercury and water people who consistently over explain because
Yeah.
nothing feels, enough to
Yeah.
describe what they're talking about. And you're such a cool anomaly of both. Like
Sure.
sometimes
Fun.
you give all of the information and more, and other times your thought is really clear in your head, and you're counting on us to figure out what the hell you're talking about.
I worked in this art gallery when I was in college as like a work study thing, and it was so much fun. And it was I went to art school, so it was a art gallery And I'm telling you, she just, I would say she gathered me in the vernacular of our time. I wanted to print things sideways or sort of at an angle because that's how I thought they would look cool. And she was like, that's absolutely unnecessary. And then I can't tell you how many times she'd go, I'm waiting for you to finish your sentence.
That's fun.
It's a long time ago, thank goodness. But yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting. So yeah, I really feel like that, that sometimes our particular language anyways has a really hard time um giving of itself in an emotional way so that the water and the earth signs can really feel like they can express all
Yeah.
of the things.
I think that's beautiful.
Yeah, definitely. I had actually said all language at one point when I was talking about this, and I realized that no, there's, the Romance languages actually probably, do an excellent job of summarizing some of that stuff that English just does not go near, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing that springs to mind is those articles that say words that can't be translated into English, that are quite beautiful. And then I think about George Bernard Shaw and My Fair Lady. He was Professor Higgins, right? He was a studier of language and sort of analyzed the implications. And for me, I found a lot of love for those type of people, just in the sense of wanting to understand the capacity of language to hold that, stuff, the nonverbal part of communicating. And there was Edward T. Hall was one of my favorite anthropologists because he had a book called The Hidden Dimension and the Silent Language. And he spent a lot of time with, Native American folks in America and Germans and Irish folks, and kind of assessed how they consider space. As a for instance, the Germans want things orderly and the Irish don't care. And so if you're living with somebody with one of those kind of habits and you're one of the people with the other habit, you're just set up for, contention over something as simple as like just shut the cabinet doors or whatever the, piece of it is. And the point of his examinations were that we are conceptualizing and then putting a word on it, and how we string them together is really important, how we create those things. And since he was writing in the 70s, so he was writing about diverse cultures versus homogeneous cultures, and how much more information you can get, like high context, like how to sneeze in Japan, discreetly, or at what age does a child learn what task, and sort of these different parameters for how we live. And in language, that's where definitely language takes a fall, because we don't even know that that's kind of what we're doing, that it's our perception that leads the language, and then the language comes back to meet us. And so in each culture, even if it's, you and I talking, we're creating our own language, and it has its own long tail or context for us. So it's fascinating.
Well, and even in our, because I'm thinking as we're talking, thinking about how this is, this complete mercurial conversation. While we have the sun and Saturn and Mercury all bang, 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 and they've just, had a party together for the week. So interesting that's where we went today.
For sure. I
Gotta love
appreciate that. Yeah. Yeah. The proof's in the
but also,
pudding.
yeah. But also thinking that, when we talk about language and when we talk about Mercury, again, the limits of where emphasis has been put on communication There's all this other part of communication that we don't even look at, that's barely analyzed, that people don't understand, like whether it's on the energetic level or whether it's, our body language or the subtle, you know what I mean? There's just so many layers and levels to how we communicate with each other. And when we're talking about this limitedness, that's
Yeah.
really only verbal.
Right. Right.
Could be culturally limited in, say, a culture that's more refined and not expressive. So it's interesting if you look at it that way, that how the
Right.
weight of Mercury and the
Yeah.
pieces of it that would be important based on cultural things as
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
I love that.
Unfortunately, my sociology degree always takes me. My brain loves that stuff. It's like, so what's the cultural component to this?
Well, the last Airbender Avatar,
I know of it, yes.
that's where my brain went. Ooh, we're all so different and we have different languages. Fire people, water people. So I'll take your sociology degree. Well, and also Saturn, right? Like in my mind, some of the things about that we talked about last time, like we started with the nodes in Taurus. And so, your job is to build things up. And then here comes the node in Aries. And the job is to have experiences, not even to blow things up, but kind of things are not the issue, things are not the point. And so, in thinking about that, the North Node in Aries, and here we have a couple of, eclipses coming up, March 25th, April 8th. It occurred to me I'm too late to get a hotel probably and see the eclipse. Are you thinking of?
No, I'm not putting myself in that vibe. I'm one of those astrologers that's like, close the curtains, do the prayer, take all the crystals out of the windows. Like, no, this one is actually happening. The first one on the 25th, which is at 5 degrees and 7 minutes of Libra,
right,
is like literally at my Jupiter Mercury midpoint and my Jupiter Uranus midpoint in my 7th house.
yeah.
So I'm just not, I don't really want to tempt it in any
No.
way.
No.
It's in a really, really critical part of my chart. So
And
let's not.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue into our topic of the day, which you would think was Mercury, but is in fact.
That's why we like this idea of what we were going to talk about. We did talk about
Eclipses. Eclipses.
Yes, we're going to talk about eclipses because they're coming up soon.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. So you can, if you know where the nodes are, you
Right.
know when the eclipses are going to be, because so this is an Aries Libra nodes. So they're
Right.
going to be in the Aries time and in the Libra time.
That's right.
So that's the easiest way to know.
Yeah, and the reasoning behind that is it is when the Earth and the Sun line up with the nodes of the moon, right? The Earth and the moon and the Sun line up with the nodes of the moon.
Yes. Yes. So if it's a new moon and it's a lunar eclipse, no, a solar eclipse, the moon gets in between the sun and the earth, and they're all conjunct, right? And so then if it is a full moon eclipse, lunar eclipse, then the earth gets in between the sun and the moon.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. If I repeat this enough times, that's going to stick in my brain. But for some reason, that is one of those tidbits of information that, like,
and again, it's the visuals, right? Like,
yeah,
I loved how you said that, people living outside. There was another descriptor that I saw that was really beautiful from NASA, right? That they said the two luminaries changed their shape. If that's not enough to scare the pants off of anybody and make you question what's going on.
Well, and even so, like this one that we have on the 25th is called an apulse lunar eclipse. And so I'm like, what does apulse mean?
Yeah.
And so it's where it's not actually close enough. It doesn't come to a complete conjunction so that only a shadow passes over. I'm like, how creepy would that? I mean, that to me, that's creepier than it just disappearing, because
Right.
it's like, what the hell is casting that big of a shadow?
Yeah.
Right. And when
Yeah.
you're always worried about being eaten,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's terrifying,
Oh my gosh.
terrifying.
Yes. And I am usually, no, I'm not. I was going to say I'm usually worried about getting eaten, but I am not at all, because that is not how we live. I love
No.
that you talked about the A pulse. I was looking up annular, total, partial, apogee, perihelion, just
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
I
Are you
need.
defining those, or are you just rattling them off?
I'm not done. I also went to look at the
You said,
sorrow cycle, and I also went to look at Bernadette Brady's
so
assessment.
did I. Look at us going to
Yes,
the same places.
we're
And I also, the other one that I really like, I
yeah.
need to give credit to um I didn't get her name right. Dietrich Pessin. I don't know if you've
Okay.
heard of her. Frank Clifford got me onto her.
Nice.
Um, and so she has a series of books called the Lunar Shadows. And we can talk about that too, because she has sort of an interesting thing that she discusses,
I'd
and
like to
it's
hear.
actually how Frank was talking about her work, was this particular thing. So yeah, I looked at that too, because it's interesting, this idea of the groupings, right? So like the
I
Saros
was so
cycle being
shocked.
these,
Yeah, like
yeah.
Bernadette was breaking them down, and it turns out that one of the ones she doesn't like is happening. Let me,
Oh,
I think it's the September one.
oh, okay. So I was going to say
Uh,
that the ones coming now were one of the more positive ones that she's described.
yeah, yeah, it's the October 2nd. It's
Oh,
and that one is at 10 degrees Libra, so 10 degrees Aries. And so what she was suggesting is, if you have planets that are in relationship, primarily conjunction with that element, 10 degrees Libra, there may be a loss. And there are always sort of conditions, but it sort of would suggest that there's a difficult time coming, in particular for those folks.
is this a bad time for me to tell you that my moon is at 10 Aries?
Well, shirt. Nope.
Excellent. I will put that in my calendar and see what
Yeah,
hits the
October
fan.
2nd. I
This
mean,
is,
yeah,
oh, sorry. I was just going to say that what's hilarious is I was at a talk at a conference. Kelly Surtees was giving it, and she was talking about eclipses. And she handed out this list of eclipse dates and where they were.
yeah,
And it's something like eclipses were just something that just never like
right,
dropped into my brain as something I found remotely interesting
right.
or useful for that matter. But then we're going through this list of eclipses. She's like, I don't think I've ever met anybody who doesn't have eclipses ever affecting their chart until this year.
Oh,
And
right.
this was like, we hadn't even thought about it, right? At
That's
that
right.
point, this is God had to have been 6 or 7 years ago now.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's like now this is the first point in my life, actually starting last year. I think it
Wow.
was last year, where I actually have an eclipse doing anything at all on my chart. So we'll see what happens, because this whole year is quite, yeah, I've got
I was getting
some
hit left
eclipse
and
stuff.
right. Yeah, with the Sagittarius Gemini hitting my sun, and just a massive, it is quite disrupting, I would say,
Is it?
without any of that.
And I know, like, from looking at other people's experiences, I know they can be extremely powerful. And those born with them,
Right.
born during an eclipse, there tends to be a real potency to
Yeah.
certain things in their life, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that we should clarify, so you've got the sun, the moon, the earth, and the nodes.
That's right.
And so you technically, in the grander scheme, there's four types of eclipses. So you either have a solar eclipse, lunar eclipse, and then they're either a north node or a south node eclipse.
Right.
And so, you know, there's a really different vibe depending on which end of the nodal axis this is happening on, right? Because the south node, like we talked about last time, is a lot more about things leaving and the idea of loss, right?
Right.
And so, whereas with the North Node, that tends to be, no matter who you read, the North Node is going to be the less malefic
Right.
of of both of them, but in eclipses, it's going to be the less potentially malefic type of eclipse. But when you look at transits, people who've had these eclipses touch their charts, both are uncontrollable events, no
Right.
matter which side, right?
Right.
There's always something like it's going to happen to you. Although, in looking at Bernadette's stuff, she does talk about how she in her work, solar eclipses tend to be more event-based and exterior. Lunar eclipses, if they're transiting your chart, tend to be more interior and be about personal change and evolution. So
Right.
there's that. I felt like I babbled a lot there. Sorry.
Absolutely not. No, there were a couple of things that I wanted to touch on, but in that last piece that you were talking about, it occurred to me this sense of, life being something to master, right? In my mind, and this is just such a goofy thought, I totally get that it's goofy. I think that life is painful enough that we don't ever have to hurt each other intentionally, and that would probably cap us all off, just that we're not immortal and our loved ones get hurt and we can't always be around the people we enjoy or whatever the thing is. I think for me yesterday, it was my husband dropped the cat litter scoop at the bottom of the recycling bin, and I hated that. I hated it. However, in saying that it's natural and part of life that things happen that are sorrowful, one of the things that I noticed in looking at the eclipses through a historic lens was the remediation that people did try. The dances that people did afterward, or the cleanses, or the different approaches to kind of how do you get back to life. And so that's one of the things that I think about a lot, because when things get so dire, it does help to know, one, when it's going to lessen up, and two, how do you navigate it? Like, how do you handle it? And sometimes you pin that information to the after time. So yeah, that was one of
Yeah,
them. Yeah.
definitely. Yes. The other thing that I did do is I did print out the chart of the eclipse.
Me
I
too.
was thinking, you were thinking, that's
Yep.
excellent.
Yep.
Yeah, I was curious to see what it looked like. So the thing that I always forget when it was Solar Fire, anyways, I don't know about anything else. When Solar Fire, which is an astrology software,
Mm-hmm.
um, figures out the eclipse, it's not about the lunation, which would mean that the sun and the moon are exactly opposite each other.
Right.
They actually calculate the eclipse. So when the shadow would happen, right? And so in this particular chart, the eclipse, the moon it's past the full moon already. Because the moon is at 6 Libra, the sun is at 5.
Right.
And
Right.
yeah, so by the time the eclipse is, the full moon is actually over. Not
Got
over,
it.
but you know what I mean. It's
Yeah.
perfected. And
Right.
so I always forget that. I think that's wrong. It figured it out wrong. I'm like, oh yeah, right. They're not the same thing. Eclipses and the lunation are not exactly the same.
Well, and I like that you said that, because that was another piece that I wanted to touch in on, is that the reason why this is happening is because there's the, what is it, 18 and change cycle of the sun lining up with the moon's nodes. I can't remember exactly what it is, but the two different cycles where the moon's lining up with the earth or the sun, one is 12 days, one is 14 days. And that's how we get our periodic eclipses, right?
Oh,
Like,
okay.
they kind of they're doing this different rhythm, but they're doing
Okay.
it outside of balance and then inside. Balance is the wrong word for an eclipse. But yeah, I find that fascinating.
Yes, it is definitely not a word that goes with eclipses.
No.
No, which is interesting. It's really interesting, especially when we're talking about the full moon eclipses,
Right.
because of the opposition.
Right.
That language would often get thrown in
Right.
when it's not appropriate at all,
Right.
because the nodes and the eclipse, there's an excess is
Yeah.
a really big part of the energy, right?
Yeah.
It's too much to handle.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so sorry, not to criticize
No,
your
no,
choice
no,
of
no,
words
no,
at
no.
all, but it's true because of, the fact that the nodes are on an axis and they're totally opposite. There's always this idea of balance that comes into the discussion. It's like when we're talking about the nodes and when we're talking about eclipses, this is all about
Right.
too much,
Right. So I
and
think about,
unpredictable.
yeah, exactly. So, for example, let's take the total eclipse, right? Like the reason why that's so extraordinary is because we literally can see the corona of light around the sun and all of the sort of activity that we do not see otherwise. And, obviously that can be analogous to any other sort of hidden that becomes quite visible. I won't say real or resolving. I will say there's a as equally strong image that is almost like a negative of where we're at, or a different dimension of where we're at. And then you got to kind of put it back together, after this. I don't know what to say, everybody. I'm trying to think.
And I,
Do it.
well, I just have this like, that you have, because when we're talking about the sun and the moon, there's always this masculine, feminine
Right.
discussion, right? And even in what they represent in the charts, moon is usually women, sun is men or father, whatever. And so if you think about just that description that you just gave, where we see the outside, we can actually see what the
Right.
sun is doing. So it's almost like the moon comes along in all of her glory and says, no, do you really want to see him? Do you really want to see what he's got going on? This is
Yeah.
the reality. He's big and shiny and obnoxious and he
Right.
burns you and it's a pain in
Right.
the ass.
Right.
But this is really the complexity. I'm going to come in here and show that to you.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. And then it's not necessarily, I'm really trying to think about information, right? And how we get information. And I'm clearly a pattern person. When you were talking about solar fire, it's a way for us to get the patterns that we would have to write out by hand using logarithms and ephemerides. And it simplifies that process. But in general, we're looking at the different patterns and how they're kind of built. And oh gosh, I'm so sorry, I lost my thought. We will pause for just a moment.
Good thing there's editing.
I I've really been enjoying that. May I say that?
Yeah.
So there's a pattern identifying component of it. And I'm not sure where in human nature there's also the desire, we're talking about language versus experience almost. And there's always this pull with experience to kind of have that make you special. Do you know what I'm saying? Or make you elite, or, what is the way to kind of recognize your yumminess is probably the best way to say it, according to me. But so you've got this like goodness, and then you live through this eclipse and you see this invisible stuff. How could that not tell you everything? And it's so interesting to me how it's almost like oracular, even esoteric information is, because there, do you know how to read signs? If you don't, you're probably going to miss a lot. At the beginning of this, we talked a little bit about, you mentioned your own experience of not necessarily paying attention to eclipses. And as I kind of, walked through my own thoughts around it, I don't think about them that much. I don't. I find them to be, in terms of contemporary astrology, not the most beneficial to kind of point out to folks. It's great if they know where their aspects are and they know how to kind of look out for it. But there's enough folks who are like, tell me another thing to make it better, that will latch onto this. And it may not, we've talked about it. No rituals, no magic, no, get your crystals out of the windows,
Yeah.
it's not a time for you to kind of start building stuff. You're going to observe what happens.
Can I give oh no, you go, you finished your thought. I don't want to interrupt you. You
You
do it.
weren't, it's so funny. So you didn't interrupt. I lost my point again. Go for it.
feel like it's my fault.
It's so not. It is so not.
I just wanted to give it, I had a really
Yeah.
clear example as you were talking
Yeah.
about like the, the things that you don't want to do. And it's like, some people when they hear, so we're talking, it's a north node eclipse and it's going to be a lot and too
Yeah.
much. And some people who are a bit Jupiterian and maybe a little bit younger or not have learned from experiences might think, I need to make money right now and I don't care how much. I'm going to do a promotion for my services or my digital, whatever it is, whatever the thing is that you're doing in your world right now. And so they do this promotion during a North Node eclipse, thinking, bring it on, I can take it. And it's so popular that it crashes all of your systems.
Exactly.
And you actually then cannot facilitate any of it. And now your reputation is forever something you're needing to work on. So that's an example of when we're saying something is too much.
Yes. It's not too much like you had to get a different horse when you went out horseback riding. It's too much like it marks your life for life. Or it can.
Yes, exactly. And so, sometimes you can't, I feel like I want to be clear that, when someone says you can't control this energy, don't take it as a challenge.
No need. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Just trust that this is just not the energy that is the best to be playing with.
I'm getting a mental picture of a guy I went to high school with who, as his science project, put up photos of him recovering from a lightning strike, and it was the first time that I had found out that it goes in one spot and comes out like usually the feet, something like that. And so it was really striking. That is kind of the level of like impact that it can have. So yeah, there's no need to put something in the way of that you cherish.
Yeah. And I have to say, just for myself, and this could just be self-fulfilled, but since I have been making sure that I do like clearing and cleansing and like more of that stuff that is compatible with the nodes and with eclipses, they are definitely less eventful. I think maybe I find that really the biggest thing I've noticed is that sometimes it affects my sleep.
Yeah.
I've had sometimes like really weird dreams, or I don't sleep well, or what, that would be sort of the thing that I would notice.
I do.
Yeah.
I do.
But I think I have benefited from doing the more ritualistic cleansing kind of stuff during the eclipses. So
I feel like I haven't done that for a little while. I used to attend to that a little more. The sleeplessness, I can't tell, because I feel like since 2015, I've been like, what's going on? What the hell's happening? What is this? Yeah. So eclipses. So they're not something where you would do magic. They're not kind of this area where it's good to kind of put your most treasured thing. They come in different flavors, solar and lunar. They are either total, which is when the moon is at apogee and it's locked in the same dimension. The annular is actually when the moon is at its farthest and it can't cover up the sun. And that's when you get that ring of fire where there's like that little bloop. And then partial is anywhere beyond 9 degrees from the node, which I thought was
the tighter it is to the node, the more total it is. Yeah, for sure. So this one that we have coming up is wide.
Yeah.
It's 10 degrees from the node.
Yes.
The one that we have in April is a much tighter orb. It's 4 degrees.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got, the sun, it's at 19 degrees of Aries with Chiron, right 3 minutes from the sun. So this is why Chiron was important earlier on, because Chiron and the node met.
Yeah.
At the degree that the node is during this eclipse. And now Chiron has moved on to join the sun. So Chiron has been inserting itself in this conversation. This whole time. It's decided it really would like to be loud this year.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, so this, this idea of collective wounds, collective um violence, collective, it's another word for with Aries. I know that on an individual level, I'm having this conversation about bravery a lot
Courage
with
does come to
people.
mind. Yeah, because
Yeah,
you have to, I mean, that's part of what feeds Aries, isn't it? Like being able to accomplish a challenge, to
yeah.
overcome or to um go to your capacity, I would say. Yeah. Yeah,
And
there
I
is.
almost feel like, in just in like whether it's friends or myself or clients, I feel like people with this eclipse that's coming, feel like they're walking up to something they're going to have to take on.
Mm,
And so there can be a really high level of stress periodically for people right now,
yeah,
because I don't know if we are all going to have to face something that we're going to have to, be brave about.
right.
But there is definitely the feeling of that for people,
A
and it's
hundred
causing,
percent. Yeah,
yeah, I feel like
yeah.
that for sure. Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
in fact, I'm feeling it now. I'm like trying to kind of sense into the sort of depth and breadth of it, of our conversation. And it's kind of keep going further, keep going further. So in honor of that, maybe we can talk a little bit about Bernadette Brady, characterizing the eclipses as leaves off a tree.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Yeah, so since the Soros cycle, SAROS, the Soros cycle, 233 months, I think is the accurate number there, can help you predict when eclipses can happen. You can begin to group the eclipses together, and she does that. And when she groups them together, she says it's a forest of eclipses. And so the desire to look at one eclipse is almost like the desire to sit by a tree and watch it grow, when it's going to take hundreds of years. And that was kind of the beginning of the discussion was, these Soros cycles happen one after another, and then they repeat one after another until they culminate. And so the cycles have, as we mentioned before, individual characteristics. And her supposition is that if you understand the Soros cycles, you will make accurate predictions with eclipses. So you can see why neither one of us is there, because we're like, no magic, no, no, even that. You can do what with an eclipse? No. And I'm joking, obviously. I'm not. Bernadette Brady's work is just fantastic, very scholarly. She even went so far as to find out the lunar eclipse Soros cycles, because they were primarily for the solar eclipses.